Welcome once again to the Mitigation Planning Coffee Break Series hosted by FEMA Region 10. Your presenter today is Brett Holt, and we have a number of panelists as well that he'll be introducing throughout the hour. I just want to say welcome to everyone, and Brett, take it away.
All right, thanks, Becca. Yeah, we got a great session today. We're going to be talking about our mitigation planning grants. This is the money here to help us get going on this. And I hope you guys have your questions ready because we got a really great group of people that are participating. As always, Amanda Syak will be here to help support us. She's our mitigation planner. We're just a two-person program here in Region 10. We have Kristen Myers. She is the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Branch Chief here for FEMA Region 10. Really oversees all these different programs in terms of our hazard mitigation grants. Angie Lane, coming from Oregon. She is the State Hazard Mitigation Officer, and she's your state point of contact for these grants. And then Susan Cleverly, State Hazard Mitigation Officer for Idaho, also your point of contact there in Idaho for the mitigation grants. You know, today I hope, we're just trying to get an idea, or hope we can convey to you how to improve upon these scopes of work for the planning grants, but also to show you some other planning activities that might be eligible. So objectives, hopefully, by the end of this, hope you can identify the 3 mitigation grant programs available through Hazard Mitigation Assistance. You have an understanding of the planning activities available under the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program. Understand the planning activities available under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, because we do want to be able to convey there are a few differences, a few more things you might be able to do under that Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and learn what is required when developing a mitigation plan scope of work. That's going to be the bulk of our session today, is about scopes of work around the mitigation planning grants. So when you're trying to develop your first-time plan or you're updating a plan, we hope to give you some additional tips on developing that. Hopefully reduce some of those requests for more information, the RFIs that may go out. But really it's about developing a good scope of work in the beginning to help have a much better product in the end in terms of something that's implementable. So for all of our sessions here, I'd like to start off with these next couple slides, just kind of lay of the land. What are we talking about? We're not talking about emergency operation plans or grants. We're not talking about the recovery. We are talking about our mitigation work here, and that is the reduction or elimination of long-term risk to human life and property from hazards. And so when through this series, we're just trying to focus in on a lot of that. Of course, the work we do does inform these other aspects of emergency management, but I always like to set the stage here that this mitigation grants, mitigation planning, this is what we're focusing on. Mitigation does a lot of work here, from the planning side to the actions, the projects, and where we're focusing these red circles is these mitigation planning grants and how they help develop, help us to achieve the public education, understanding risk and capabilities, building the relationships through this mitigation planning process. Of course, that informs our actions and our projects, but we want you to see through this. This is kind of a focus today is the actual plan itself. So the funding, how do plans get funded? And you guys might have a lot of other ways out there. There's a few things that we've seen. Of course, there's local funds, staff time. It doesn't require the grants or anything. It's local funds went into this and they help supported the plan. Another one we've seen is funding of positions through the Emergency Management Grant Programs, EMPG. I can speak to that here in Washington where we've seen that a few times. It doesn't happen as much, but it's definitely out there. And of course, the topic for today, funding of the plans through our Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program, our Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. And we'll focus really much more on those top two. So what I'm going to do right now is I want to turn this over to Kristen Myers, our Hazard Mitigation Branch Chief, here to speak some about the guidance and just really give a nice overview of the Mitigation Grant Program.
Great, thanks, Brett. Thanks everybody for joining us today. So this first slide here is where we're really showing you the Hazard Mitigation Assistance guidance, and this is essentially the rules of the road for all 3 of our mitigation grant programs, and this guidance applies to both planning grants and also any project grants that you would do once you've selected an activity that you want to apply in your community to reduce the risks that you've identified in your plan and put some of those mitigation strategies to action. So this is available in the FEMA library, and if you're considering looking for mitigation grant funding through FEMA, this is really the best guidebook for you to understand the rules that we have to follow in applying those grant programs. And so now just a little bit about each of the programs and the differences between them, and so you can think about what's going to be the right fit for you and your community. So the first one I want to talk about here is the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program. This is a program that is offered as a national competitive program. It's available annually, depending on the funding that's available through Congress and through the budget cycle. So this is one, once we have funding available for the year, we'll open up an application period, and those for local communities, you do still apply through your state hazard mitigation office and state hazard mitigation officer. They'll take all the interested parties and compile those applications and prioritize and send them up to FEMA for the national competition. Tribes can apply directly to FEMA for this grant funding, and then they would work with the regional office to make sure they have access to the system to apply. Go ahead, thanks. Another program we have is Flood Mitigation Assistance. This program is funded through the Flood Insurance Fund, through the National Flood Insurance Program. So this program is focused on reducing flood hazards only, and it's also focused on reducing the flood hazard to NFIP insured properties. Now, the way planning grants fit into this is there is a portion of this grant program that does allow for flood hazard reduction, flood mitigation planning. Those grants do have to focus on flood hazards alone, although they do have to be connected with your all hazards mitigation plan. But one thing to note here is that for planning grants, the funding of the federal share is capped at $25,000. So that may not be enough to meet your need for that flood mitigation planning. So you may want to consider actually looking and just including that flood as a part of any all hazard mitigation planning efforts that you do, and get into enough depth there that you don't need a separate funding source for the flood piece. And then the final program is called Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. This is one that is available state by state. It's connected with disaster declarations. So if a state gets a declaration for a disaster event, then an additional amount of funding is available to the state for the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. Again, this is managed through the state, so that each state will run their application project or program and application timeline however they choose. So they can focus that in the areas that were impacted by the disaster. They may compete it statewide, and that's a couple of different things. So I maybe open up and give Angie and Susan an opportunity if they'd like to talk a little bit about how they run an application or look for planning grants through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program.
Well, this is Angie. Planning grants through the HMGP, at least in Oregon, we have a quarterly state interagency hazard mitigation team meeting. And at those meetings, we discuss opportunities for communities and other folks who we think might be eligible for funding under HMGP, and out of that discussion, we also keep track of whose plans are near expiration or at expiration, and we try to push funding to those entities first that might be coming up on their plans needing to be updated and their near expiration. So that's kind of how we look for planning opportunities.
Great. Thanks, Angie. And one thing I'd add here is just to set a realistic expectation for your state agencies is actually the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program has a rule that caps the amount of that funding that can be spent on plans. So it's really targeted more towards doing mitigation projects. So each state is going to see a cap of only being able to spend up to 7% of that each individual disasters program on planning. So you may not end up seeing a whole lot of funding available depending on the event.
All right. So let's go to our first polling question here. It's our interactive piece here with our participants. So 2 questions for you. If you have a current or expired mitigation plan, how do you fund the plan development? And kind of thinking majority of it here. So if you think majority of it was all done by just local funds and staff time, go ahead and let us know. Perhaps you had a non-FEMA grant to help support this, EMPG, or you did use a FEMA planning grant, or of course it's not applicable. And then if you used a FEMA mitigation planning grant, what did you use? A PDM, HMGP? If you just did a flood mitigation grant or a plan, did you use FMA? Not sure or not applicable. I know a number of folks on this call here are from different agencies or the contractors support a lot of different planning and whatnot. Again, as we've just gone through those, you guys are filling this out here. I'll give you another minute. We were talking about the 3 different programs. There's projects and there's planning grants. And as you can see, we're really trying to we're focusing on the planning grant aspect here of this webinar here. Just give you guys another few seconds. And again, we have the questions here. Go ahead and type in your questions as you're hearing the information we're presenting, and we're going to try to spend that last 10 minutes or so of this webinar. We'll check out your questions and do the round robin here with Susan and Angie and Kristen and I on hopefully we can answer them. And of course, we'll always have that contact information here at the end. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'll close this poll here, and I think we can. I was going to show you the results just to kind of get an idea of where we're going. I'll do that in just a minute here. So the application process here, we have it's kind of showing, you know, how do we apply? Who can apply? What's the process that it works? Oh, here we go with the results. Let me just show you. I think you guys might be able to see, but you can see that. From those who applied, a lot of them are the FEMA planning grants, but a lot of local funds, staff time, we're helping to support that, which is great. And then those who did use a FEMA planning grant, definitely the HMGP and the pre-disaster mitigation one was the #1 there. So good to hear. I really like to see that local fund staff time. I think that's great to see those local capabilities to get in there. So, all right, I will go ahead and close that. So applications. So as you can see in the top there, individual homeowners, businesses, private nonprofits, well, you can't apply direct. You can go through other state agencies. You can go through the local governments who can be the actual sub-applicants. Tribes can go, of course, direct with us or through the state as applicable. And then from the state, it comes up to FEMA on this process. Anything to add on that, Kristen?
No, I think you covered it. Thanks.
All right. So let's go into the planning activities themselves. What's eligible under PDM and HMGP? What's HMGP only? So first looking here, for PDM HMGP, we can, update or fund a new plan, whether it was state, local, or tribal plans, and the 2.1.4, 5, 6, and 7 references the planning requirements in our Code of Federal Regulations. The plan, of course, the grant is basically saying you're going to develop a plan that will be approved within the period of performance on that. So we would like that's the one that both PDM, HMGP, the PDM grants, really you come in, it must lead to an updated plan here through our planning grants. HMGP eligible plan activities, it goes beyond just leading to an updated plan itself. And Kristen, if you can correct me, do you know when the change was in guidance here, especially for those who maybe have been working with FEMA grants for a number of years? Was that the 2015 guidance that made this change?
No, actually, the 2013 guidance is the first time we saw this flexibility for the states to use and prioritize HMGP planning-related activities that may be tied to mitigation planning, but not having to be couched within a full mitigation plan update.
Okay, great. So since 2013, we've so beyond just having a plan through HMGP, some of the activities, you could just get a planning grant to focus on a very specific part of your mitigation plan. So maybe just doing a risk assessment. I have an example up here. Those in Alaska may recognize this as avalanche study. I recognize when this was done, it had to lead to a plan, but now under the guidance, we would be able to do a standalone risk assessment study, perhaps for an avalanche study. You might just focus in on the mitigation strategy, or perhaps an assessment of want to do something with climate adaptation, green building, smart growth principles. So we have some specific stuff we can do there. Let me go to our next, there we go. The other activity is about integrating information from the plans. So perhaps you're integrating this information into a disaster recovery strategy, comprehensive plan, capital improvements, resource management plans, or some other long-term community planning initiative. Building capabilities through delivery of technical assistance and or training, rather broad, maybe something that the state might want to develop or push forward, but that could be another option. And evaluating adoption and or implementation of ordinances that reduce risk and or increase resilience. We've got an example here down in Tillamook County. They did a code and program review. It was funded in another program, but this would be an example of what could be done through the HMGP planning activities. Kristen, anything to add on these HMGP planning activities? We haven't seen a lot of them in our region yet. We've got a couple, but.
Yeah, the one thing I would add is to really, as you're thinking about your needs for mitigation planning is looking at your plan, or if you're doing your full planning process, is to define any gaps in data or gaps in information that you need. That way, if there is an opportunity to fund just a risk assessment where you do need to collect or develop more data, or you really want to dig into some specific issues and find some alternatives for mitigating those issues you've identified, or combining the information you learned when you're mitigation planning in with other plans and other programs within your communities. These are really good things to just identify in that initial plan, so that when these opportunities for additional funding come up, that you can jump on those opportunities. And just to highlight again, this is just in the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and so if you have any ideas, things you want to work on, talk with your state hazard mitigation officer about what you may try to accomplish, and if you're trying to do something new, if that's something that they're going to be able to prioritize through their funding process.
All right, and of course we have ineligible planning activities. I'm going to ask Kristen to speak to some of this these ineligible activities through the HMGP program, 7%.
Right. So there's pieces in here that we want to make clear that we can't fund through the HMGP planning funds as standalone items. So if we're just going for mapping and equipment that's for mitigation activities, or just GIS systems and hardware or data acquisition, just that piece of it is not eligible as a standalone, as an activity. Direct public awareness and education campaigns, and then doing the actual development of a project scope of work is not eligible under the planning grant activities. What you'll notice here, though, is that we refer to the 5% initiative in these first three. So that is there is a 5% of any pot of HMGP that's available in as a result of a declaration, can be used on some of these different public awareness or type of programs that may not have any other direct connection to the plan or to a specific project. And for bullet 4 here, project scoping and development, that type of funding is available as pre-award costs in a project grant, and we also have something called advanced assistance that can work to do that. So just because it's not eligible under this planning area of the grant doesn't mean it's fully not available at all. So that's why these pieces are ineligible as a planning activity, just because they are eligible through different sources. And then finally, number 5, we're not able to fund anything that doesn't have a clearly defined scope of work and a clearly defined deliverable, a clearly defined outcome. That's just essential for us to understand what it is we're funding and if the budgets and the schedules are appropriate.
And just to let you guys know, if you see up on top, we have a few places where it says sections E or some other places. That is actually referenced in the Hazard Mitigation Assistance guidance. So when you guys pull this, you guys always have, we'll make these materials available to you after, where to go into the guidance to see what we're talking about. So thanks, Kristen. So now we're going to really dive into some of the scope of work piece, give you a few examples. This applies, and we're focusing on the tribal and the local mitigation plans. This is not something we're necessarily speaking on the state level plans right now. So,
hey, Brett.
Yes.
There was a question before we lose Kristen. There's been a couple different questions about funding, primarily if there will be, if we know if there will be a PDM program this year or what type of funding we'll have for that.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I can speak to that and say that I do not know what will happen for PDM this year. We're still waiting on a full budget from Congress for 2017. We're currently under a continuing resolution through the end of April 28th or 29th. And so once we learn more about what Congress will be funding for the remainder of the year is when we'll know what we'll have for PDM in 2017.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's always a big one up there. So there's funding available. So, and I like to even show this, that even like, so in the beginning we asked how people fund plans or get plans done. They were showing some other non-FEMA funding. I think some of this work here we're going to talk about around scopes of work and really thinking ahead of time, what's that outcome? I think this is very applicable to some of that. So hopefully you'll still be able to have that takeaway, no matter right now what our current the funding situation is. So some initial tips here on this is, a well-developed scope of work improves the outcome of a well-developed natural hazard mitigation plan. When developing scopes of work, don't just focus on, let me just meet the planning requirements, which of course does need to be done, and we have to see in their scope of work that, you're showing how you meet that you're going to meet 201.7, the tribal planning requirements, or the 201.6 local mitigation planning requirements. But focus on developing an implementable plan here, something that will actually be usable for you guys. Focus on the activities you want the grant to pay for. It's just not about, as it says in 3, don't just focus on, I see sometimes writing sections of the plan are actually in this scope of work. But, it's really looking at what are these activities? What do we want to do with public engagement? What do we really do with our risk assessment? Thinking through this a bit ahead of time. And we'll have some examples here. Ensure the scope of work demonstrates a clear understanding of mitigation planning and the purpose of the grant. And one thing for the PDM grants, develop a scope of work that is uploaded into e-grants, not just using their form, but have something you can attach. Thinking about tips just initially, and I know we're going to more detail, I'm going to ask, both Angie or Susan if they have some initial tips now as people are just approaching their scopes of work here for the planning grants. What should they be thinking about, or something you discuss with your jurisdictions?
So this is Angie again, and the one thing that I encourage folks to do is not only pay attention to what's in guidance, but definitely look at the CFR, the section 201.6. That walks you through, the type of content that we're going to be looking for in the plan, and with that, knowing what the content is or what the content should be, whether you're starting from scratch or you're just doing maintenance, that would help, in my mind, that helps formulate your scope of work.
Great. Susan, do you have anything when you're discussing with jurisdictions, just some of the general approach, different things for them to think about?
Tool. Can you hear me?
We can, Susan, yes.
Okay. We have them look at the local review tool to also see the type of questions that will be asked as we're reviewing the plan, which also goes right along with, as Angie said, the CFR guidance. We also have them ask themselves who, what, when, where, why as they're developing a scope of work. If they're going to be doing a contract for part of their plan, then we want to know how they're going to interact with their contractor and who or where or what they're going to do for their public outreach activities.
Perfect. Thank you. And this is what we'll start diving into a bit. What's it, in the HMA guidance, it does talk about the following elements must be included in the activities description, that part of your scope of work: planning area, planning process, previous mitigation planning efforts, available data and risk assessment process, development of the strategy, and the plan adoption. And then, of course, we're going to be talking about deliverables, task, and schedule. So let's start taking a dive into this. And this, again, as I point out, this is for local and the tribes when we're doing it. So the planning area, what should be in our scopes of work when we're thinking about addressing the planning area? Well, of course, talking about, what are the general demographics of the area, talk about both the contiguous and non-contiguous land holding or assets. Who are the proposed participants? And there's a key word about proposed. We recognize in multi-jurisdictional plans, it's not always, easy to understand. Each specific jurisdiction that might be signing on, as well as the special districts that might be part of the plan. But taking that initial effort in the beginning to really see who is part of this, as well as is this a single, multi-jurisdictional plan. If you are, for those who do multi-jurisdictional plans with tribes, your scope of work will need to clearly identify how you meet both the local planning requirements as well as the tribal planning requirements. And we have a suggestion, of course, is consider obtaining letters of intent from jurisdictions right from the beginning. If you can get them from the city, the counties, those have that really going to be part of it. And this is an example. This is from Susan's state of Idaho, where they put together a letter of intent just showing their commitment to participate in the county plan. This is from the city. And it's just showing that verbal recognition. Perhaps, of course, doing this, it came from a superintendent of the Public Works Department. Great way to start getting that buy-in right from the beginning. And I'll just throw that to Kristen and Angie and Susan. I'll just pause at each of these, and if you guys have something to add, just please do. Planning process. So thinking about our process, right? Where are we going with this? What's this going to look like, this schedule here? So thinking about what's the role of the planning team? And those of us who were here in February, we talked about building the mitigation planning team and the different stakeholders that would be part of it, the different departments or jurisdictions. So this is that part where you want to start thinking about, if this is an update to a plan, well, who was part of it before? Who should be in here? How the team's going to work together, that meeting frequency. Are you guys going to be trying to meet, once a month or quarterly? And describing on these multi-jurisdictional plans, so how will the team leads communicate with their respective jurisdictions throughout the planning process? Remember, we were saying it's just not about a representative for a jurisdiction to come together, but they are going to have to come back and talk to their specific communities. So thinking right now, what does that process look like? And then the public engagement part of our process. What's the grant paying for? Are you conducting a public survey? If so, what kind? Are you going to hold workshops or forums? How many? What's it look like? Are you going to integrate the CWPP? So you're going to have focused outreach with some wildfire community individuals. Are you conducting specific stakeholder outreach, such as populations or neighborhoods? We had a couple examples here, what we saw in when they described their public engagement process. The public meetings will be documented with sign-in sheets and minutes. A minimum of 5 public meetings will be conducted. Will be advertised in the daily Sitka Sentinel. Talking about community input survey, and they even talked about the website that they'll be using, which was You know, they're just giving us right off the bat. We kind of understand, right, you know, where the community is going to be going with this. And so any questions or I'm sorry, any comments from Angie or Susan, Kristen?
Yeah, Brett, this is Kristen. I'll go ahead and jump in and just mention, with the planning process and with defining that planning area, and you'll see this throughout, a lot of it is going to point back to what kind of schedule do you need to be on, and then also what funds do you need to accomplish this so that your cost estimate is close to what you're going to need. But a third thing to think about is, this funding is not 100% federal funded. There is going to be a requirement of about typically a 25% cost share. And so knowing who's going to be a part of this, and from the team perspective and how much time they're going to be working on it, that'll give you a good sense of whether you can use their time as in-kind match, especially if they're not funded through other federal sources. So that's a great way to really think about how are the communities going to work together to have their 25% of the cost covered.
Yeah, that's a great point there about that match there. So thank you. So previous mitigation planning, what we're asking here is describe your previous efforts. Describe the evaluation of the past plan as a basis. Susan had mentioned to look back at the last planning tool. What did it say in there in terms of what, some of maybe the areas of improvement? Of course, look at your last plan and looking at your strategies. Maybe there's some here that you identified in terms of some additional risk assessment work or some better strengthening development of your strategies. Use that as a basis and really highlight in your scope of work. This is the focus. This is, yeah, we're going to meet the planning requirements, but this is where we want to focus our efforts. I'll show you an example of what we're thinking here. This was down in Oregon, one of the jurisdictions. They just fill out this sheet, just generally saying kind of what they've been doing with mitigation planning. So they described how the maintenance and the implementation of what they did. They identified some of the local partners here. And then they talk about new data they were thinking about, new hazard data for landslides. Talking about some of where they use some local in-fund or in-kind match there. But it's a very simple way to kind of start approaching this to say, all right, what have we been doing and what do we do to move forward? And when we talked about the plan review tool, those who are receiving that for tribes, it's actually it looks a little different. It will be in the crosswalk where we might have comments, recommended improvements, or recommended revisions. But here for the locals, you can see opportunities for improvement. And these are the areas you might want to look at and consider that for your next scope of work. Great way to get some good information and get your team to start thinking about what does that next plan look like. Our risk assessment. So this is a pretty big, we got a couple slides on this. So what we're asking here is what hazards do you want to assess? Just keep in mind, remember our planning grants are for the natural hazards. Plans, of course, can include non-hazards, but the grant doesn't pay for it. But we are focusing. Let us know what you're looking at for your hazards here. What are your potential data sources? How will it be researched, collected, analyzed, and summarized? What tools are you going to use? GIS, HAZIS, FSIM, Wildland Firefighter risk assessment work. For HAZIS, what we have, and I'll show you the tool. Are you using the HAZIS checklist? Sometimes we've seen where staff, first of all, just because we have seen this recently, HAZIS is not a requirement for our risk assessments. It's a suggestion if you want to use it, but you do not have to use it. But if you're going to use it, we have a tool here, kind of thinking about ahead of time, what are you trying to achieve here? And that's really just with risk assessment work. And next month, Amanda's going to go into the risk assessments and how to approach them. But what are you trying to do with your risk assessment work here? You have data to be collected. If you have a risk map project in your area, we highly encourage, looking at that data. Perhaps that's your best available data. Describe to us, how you use this data for your plan. Are you going to be doing some new data development? Are you considering a socioeconomic vulnerability analysis, incorporating climate change data? So going through this really helps to really think about, okay, what's this plan look like? And of course, informing your strategies.
Yeah, this is Kristen. I'd just add on, I think this is really thinking through what you want to do with the risk assessment, looking back at any previous plans and gaps in information for you to make, as a community, to make decisions about what you want to do to reduce your risk. So this is really a great opportunity to look at those gaps and get the resources to start to fill those so that you can make better decisions on how to keep your community safe.
And I would add, this is Angie, that as far as risk assessment goes and data collection, your committee members, they may have been doing efforts just in their regular day-to-day business with some sort of data collection that might be appropriate to bring in and use to update your data from your last risk assessment. So having that kind of discussion with everybody in the committee, that's where you can really start finding out who has what.
Excellent. And, you know, we'll talk about the committee. When we do a pre-award cost here in just a few slides, we'll talk about where does the committee getting together and how's that eligible. So really good point there, Angie. Thank you. So an example, so this is the hazards checklist that, from my understanding, we've made available in Region 10. This is going to be one of the, after when we have our materials made available for all the participants here, you'll be able to download this and look at it. But it's thinking about the inputs. Has this at just the default data, and it's okay. But really where the power of hazards comes in is the inputs are specific to the local jurisdictions. And so we're asking you here, because if the more data you're trying to collect, actually the more time and effort is going to require, and maybe perhaps more additional funding here. So this will be made available afterwards. We're talking about climate, you know, is there some climate change assessments that will be involved? This was an example from the Quinault Indian Reservation and some work that they did through their plan update recently. And over in Idaho, they're doing some work, part of their plans, they're doing some socioeconomic vulnerability assessments that are part of their plans. So just some of the stuff that is fundable through, you know, through these grants, and, you know, really write them into these scopes of work ahead of time so we can see where you're going with this. The fifth part here, go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, Brett. Yeah, really thinking about these planning grants as an opportunity for you to fill the needs that your community has. In the mitigation plans, there's certainly provide that eligibility checkbox to get the mitigation project grants through the FEMA funding sources, but there's so much more benefit to the mitigation plans and the process and having these conversations about what the risks are in your community. If you've already got a plan completed and this is an update, you're just trying to go through the motions and check that box again, and it is really not the best use of these funds. You've got a whole lot of opportunity to really drill down on some of the top priority issues for your community, and making sure you get the right amount of funding through your grant to do that is important. So understanding what you really want to accomplish through a plan update process and pick those top priority topics to invest in, this is really the great opportunity to do that.
All right. And then the development of the mitigation strategy. So we're asking you to describe the process to develop the strategy for each jurisdiction based on the risk assessment, right? That connection here, how will the strategies developed connect to the risk assessment analysis? Thinking about that, you know, when you develop think about where your impacts are at. So what's that process going to look like? So we're also, you know, asking, will the planning grant pay perhaps for an in-depth analysis of how the plan will be integrated into local comprehensive plans and other planning mechanisms? We know that's a requirement, and sometimes that's kind of a listing with a few comments of what that process is. But perhaps you're looking at a little bit more analysis. So let's really look at the comp plan and see where we want to go through, and in our next update, really integrate information from the mitigation plan. Perhaps you're, you know, if you want to take a bit more of a deep dive, you know, describe that level of effort and what that process entails. And example where we had a plan a couple years ago where they started pulling out sections from their comp plan that was inside the mitigation plan, really kind of speak to, look, this is where it speaks to fire. And they were describing how they might be doing some updates into here. This is over in Yakima County here that they did that. Really good work. And this is just wildfire. Every section of the plan for each hazard was really taking that deep dive. So that was great to see. Great to see out there.
I would I would also, I want to touch on that word process. When you're putting your scope of work together for an application, and it's probably harder with a grant where you're asking to update your plan. Just because you're going to update your plan doesn't mean we don't still want to know your process. And if you're not very descriptive, if all you say is we're going to update our mitigation strategies, period, that's not describing the process. And we can't get at the evaluation of your budget if we don't know what you're going to be spending money on, what kind of time it's going to take you, and what kind of process or analysis you're going to be doing to get there.
Great point. Yes, the description of that process. Point A to B, what's this going to look like? All right. And the last part is plan adoption. Of course, it's describing that this will be adopted by each jurisdiction, final approval by FEMA. We encourage you on this is plan that you're going to have the plan that you will submit this mitigation plan up to the state at least 6 months prior to the end of the grant period of performance. Sure, it adds for adequate time for the state to do their review as well as FEMA to do their review. And I would even recommend this if tribes are coming direct with FEMA, leave yourself that amount of time just to make sure that everything gets done and approved in a timely manner. So just some other considerations, and I'm really looking at Susan and Angie and Kristen on this. You know, we're throwing out there some things to think about. If you're hiring, if the local jurisdiction's applying and you're going to be hiring a contractor to assist with any aspect of the plan development, I'm really asking, describe how you'll be coordinating with the contractor. We recognize that many plans are done with contract support, whether it's the entire plan, or perhaps you're just having a contractor to come in and do the public engagement piece, or just some risk assessment work as you're updating this. But describe that process. We're just want to ensure that you guys are fully invested and involved with working with the contractor and vice versa. Describe any travel that the grant will fund, and that will be a piece under the travel. And of course, under that travel is any training that the jurisdiction's participants will attend. This includes, but not limited to, the G318 Local Mitigation Planning Workshop, perhaps some hazards training that would help out. And this isn't just for the lead jurisdiction. This could be for any of the participating jurisdictions. Any comments, though, from Kristen and Angie of just thinking about the contract work and the travel and the funds here? And Susan, sorry.
This is Angie. I would just, make sure in your scope of work, and one way of tackling it is just to describe the tasks and assign who's responsible for those tasks. So whether it's yourself or your contractor.
This is Susan. I wanted to add to that as you do that with especially if you're going to hire a contractor, that almost helps you develop the scope of work for your contract with your contractor and what points you want them to cover and the duties that they'll have in fulfilling that contract.
Hey, just a quick poll just to get you guys thinking a little bit using your yes or no buttons. As you guys think for those who participated with some of these or use these grants, we're just curious if you have used these grants for some of your training needs here. If you can kind of go back and I think, Becca, you tell me they can just use the yes/no questions here. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes, they can use red X or green check mark in the participant.
Okay, there we go. Green check box. How about? Perfect. Yeah, just do that green check box if you've used it, or an X there if you haven't used the travel funds for some of the training. Just trying to get an idea who out there has used it, or if it's a no, perhaps you weren't even aware that exists. So just trying to see how we're doing here. Got a few check boxes coming through. Some no's. Definitely some more no's. A few. Oh, we got an X. Went from a green to an X there. Just seeing that. So it looks like a lot more maybe haven't used it, and maybe it's just you weren't aware that that's eligible, or maybe there's some other reasons there. But good to see some folks already taking advantage of that. And I think it's an important part. This is about building your capabilities as a jurisdiction, not just, of course, to get the plan done, but really take advantage of this grant to get your plan and help develop those capabilities. So great to see. Thank you folks for tuning in or checking those boxes, letting us know. I think there's a way to, there we go, a little clear on that. All right, and deliverables. I'm going to turn it to Kristen and kind of talk about the deliverables, task schedule, what this kind of starts to look like for folks.
Great. So when we talk about what's really required of a scope of work, this is where you've thought through all the things that you need and you really need to define it. So for some things, the end deliverable is pretty basic. For a PDM grant, you're writing a mitigation plan, and that plan is going to meet the Code of Federal Regulations section that applies to the type of jurisdiction you are. And it's really helpful to have that defined up front for everybody. We are writing a mitigation plan. It's going to follow these rules. But then you get into more detail of how is that actually going to be accomplished. Susan said the who, how, why, what, where, when, and so really thinking through those different steps of how is this going to get from A to B, how's that going to be accomplished, how much time do I need to do all of this stuff. If it's just a single community, maybe we can get everybody to the table and get everything done within 6 months. If it's a county with many other communities involved, you may need to take quite a bit more time to do all of the different steps. So those are some of the important things. So really defining what are the deliverables, what are the tasks, what's the schedule, and that's also going to help you develop that cost estimate to make sure that you are requesting enough funds to do the work that you are proposing. And also understanding what kind of funding commitment the community or communities are going to have to put in to get that accomplished as well.
All right, and we have an example of a schedule here I put together, or I didn't put together. I'm showing you that we had from a jurisdiction, but when they submitted this up, they're just showing you here's their task. They can, you know, it's starting to associate. I get it with dates, but and this might shift depending on when the actual funding gets obligated. But they started to put in there, what does this look like? What are we trying to achieve? What are the subtasks? You can see the time of year they were going through this. We have a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet that's made available for folks here, but I think it's a great approach for some of this work here. In our last section here, we just want to talk about some of the pre-award costs. And so again, I'm gonna turn to Kristen on some of our pre-award costs here.
Great. So I just want to highlight what pre-award costs are. So this is basically work that you as a community need to do to get your application ready, to make those decisions on what are our top priorities and how are we going to get that done. So that may mean getting an initial steering committee together so that you can talk together and it's not just one person creating the scope of work and expecting everybody else to be a part of it. You can get that steering committee together and they can help make those decisions. You could also attend one of the G318's mitigation planning workshop courses to understand, okay, what are the rules of the road for writing a plan? That way you can scope your actual grant better. Another thing to consider is that maybe you wouldn't need to be reimbursed for those costs. Perhaps it's just staff time, but if you document that and it's all happening within an open application period, if you document that time, then it's something that you could potentially use as part of your non-federal cost share. Be forewarned, if you start working on the plan itself, start writing the plan before the grant is awarded, then that's not a planning grant we would be able to fund if you start work before it's actually awarded. So making sure you kind of keep that firm line between work you're doing to develop your scope of work and develop your grant application versus the work of actually starting the plan update.
Thank you, Kristen. A lot of things to think about with pre-award, especially I relate that first bullet point. If you guys weren't aware, bring the committee together to help develop the scope of work. We're finding that sometimes these committees are not brought together You guys aren't usually coming together until after funding's funding's been obligated, and the whole scope of work's been done by one person. So really encourage you to take advantage of some of this, so that using one of your maintenance meetings perhaps. So I just got to kind of be finishing off here. But if you guys have questions, go ahead, and we're gonna about 5 or 6 minutes here, and just type in your questions, and we're going to go through them. We have the listings here for each of our states in Region 10 of where you can learn more about the Hazard Mitigation Assistance grants and where the announcements are at. We're going to, hopefully through this webinar, you've been identify what are 3 mitigation grant programs available, understand the planning activities under PDM grants, as well as the activities under HMGP, and of course learn what's required when developing a mitigation plan scope of work. These are our State Hazard Mitigation Officer contacts: Brent Nichols in Alaska, Susan Clevery in Idaho, Angie Lane in Oregon, and Tim Cook in Washington. We got some resources for you, both from our Hazard Mitigation Assistance, the guidance and their site, as well as there's a local mitigation plan scope of work template. Oh, I forgot the L on that template. Looking at that template, the only thing I would say to you is use that just to kind of think through. Don't use that as something just to copy and change a name, but definitely use that as a reference. We have the local mitigation planning handbook, our planning site, and of course the link for our coffee break series. Next month, Amanda Syak is going to be leading us on performing natural hazard risk assessments. And really not just, it's going through the process, but it's also thinking, as it's been brought up today, is what do you want to do with this? How do you take this and connecting it to these strategies? And so we're going to be going through that on May 26th. Registration will open up shortly. Or, I'm sorry, registration is open for that now, so it is on the link, or it's on our website. And of course, here's our rest of our series. June is also open now. Both May and June, you can register for those particular ones. And our G318, we were talking about that just on this for funding it. We've got a series of G318s coming up, Lewiston, Idaho, just in a few weeks there, hosted by the Nez Perce tribe over down in the Dalles, so hosted by Oregon Emergency Management. And then we're now working on some dates up in Anchorage, Alaska, and down here in Linwood, Washington. Hope you can join us for that. So with that, I'm just trying to see, I'm going to go through, and I see a question here. When can the state be the sponsor, a subgrantee, for a business, individual, or special districts? So if somebody wants to, Susan or Angie or Kristen, they're based at, when can the state be the sponsor for a business, individual, or special districts?
So this is Kristen. I'll go ahead and just start and say that's for any grant offering, that is always an option, but it's up to the state to decide if that's something that they would like to do.
This is Susan. We have not had a special district come in and want to do their own planning grant, and so I'll kind of defer to another state on that.
We have had special districts that are interested in doing their own plan, and they work with our planner. There's a template we have available that they can utilize.
Okay. Another question. Be honest, Randy, I'm not sure if training's eligible. Why did FEMA blanket something from our grant application? I think we're missing a word on that one, Rand. I'm not sure what was being asked. Something about the grant application before approving it. I'm not sure on that one, to be honest. It might be specific to that particular grant, but I'm not sure in that case. Another one's for tribal nations or any other, in Region 9 or any other region trying to take advantage of a presidential disaster to develop a new or updated mitigation plan. Is there a set deadline for the completion of these hazard mitigation grant plans? Great question, Brigitte. So we're basically looking at if a tribe doesn't have a current plan, is that what you're saying, and they're trying to take advantage of the declaration, what's the timeline on that? Currently, it's 30 days from the date of declaration with an option of, at regional administrator's approval, an extra 90 for a total of 120 days. But we encourage, as well as all of our jurisdictions, is working on these plans, especially the tribes, counties, cities, getting this, these are our pre-disaster mitigation grant plans. To the degree possible, and as capabilities allow, we're really trying to get these done prior. I'm going to just open up the.
Kristen.
Go ahead, Kristen.
Let me capture a couple of things I saw in here. One is a question on training. Those trainings do have to be directly applicable to a hazard mitigation plan and plan writing, so that so it's not just any training. It does have to be applicable to that grant itself. And then I saw another question in here about what is the application process and timeline for these grants. And so I'll just say a couple of things here. One is with the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, that's going to vary state to state and disaster to disaster. So make sure you're working with your state hazard mitigation officer on timing for that, of any of those applications. And then for the pre-disaster mitigation and the FMA programs, if there's an offering of those, the application periods are open for typically 90 days to get your application in. And then depending on the timing of that funding, the selection will typically take another 2 to 3 months to find out if you've been selected for funding. And then actually getting awarded may take up to another year, just depending on where we are in all of our funding cycles. So that is something to think about in terms of when does your plan expire or when do you want to have a plan written, and make sure, especially for the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program, be thinking ahead a couple of years really before you need to get started. So unfortunately that can come right on the tails of you getting your plan approved, but you may know right then what type of things you want to work on next time, so it may be a good opportunity to start thinking about that scope of work.
Kristen, this is Susan.
Go ahead, Susan.
In Idaho, we actually have to shorten up that 90-day application period to 60 days so that we have a review panel that reviews the applications and scores and ranks them before they go off to FEMA. So our application period is shortened to 60 days there.
Thanks, Susan. That's a great point. Always, because unless you're a tribe, you do have to go through a state if you're a local entity or a local jurisdiction. So make sure you're keeping in touch with your state hazard mitigation officer, because they are all of those applications have to come through them to FEMA, and they need time to make sure that they're looking good and are picking the state's top priority applications to move forward.
And it looks like we have one more. We're just a couple minutes over. I'm going to just throw, it says, what are some examples of match or in kind that we might have?
I will, actually we have a cost share guide available through the HMA program, so I will ask that that's sent out to everybody as a part of our package of post-training information.
Perfect. I know there might be a couple other questions there. You're more than anybody. If we didn't answer the questions, just feel free to email myself, Becca. We have contact information, of course, in this PowerPoint. You can contact our state hazard mitigation officers would be your best source. Thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Becca Croft. And first, thank you, Angie Lang. Thank you, Susan Cleverly, and Kristen Myers. Appreciate you guys joining us today.
You're welcome.